There is a certain kind of person the world never stops stepping on. Not because they are weak in the obvious sense, not because they lack intelligence, effort, or even moral depth, but because somewhere along the way, they learned to survive by shrinking. Modern psychology loves to talk about trauma, resilience, and healing, but it rarely asks a more uncomfortable question. What happens to a mind that is repeatedly overpowered, silenced, ignored, and still expected to remain good, calm, patient, and understanding? This is not the psychology of a single failure. This is the psychology of a lifetime of being overruled. The perpetually crushed individual does not scream. They adapt. They rationalize injustice. They internalize blame. And eventually, they begin to confuse endurance with virtue. Friedrich Nietzsche once warned that prolonged suffering does not automatically create wisdom. Sometimes, it creates resentment that has learned to disguise itself as morality. And this is where the real damage begins. Because when a person is crushed again and again, something subtle happens. They stop asking, "Why is this being done to me?" and start asking, "What is wrong with me that this keeps happening?" Psychologists call this learned helplessness. But that term is too clean, too academic, too bloodless. What we are really talking about is a slow psychological conditioning process, where the mind is trained to expect defeat before the battle even begins. Over time, the crushed individual develops a distorted relationship with power. They fear it, they admire it, they resent it, and yet they unconsciously submit to it. They may speak the language of peace, kindness, and patience, but beneath those words often lies something far darker, a terror of confrontation, a fear of visibility, and a deeply ingrained belief that asserting oneself will only lead to punishment. Carl Jung once said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." For the perpetually crushed, this terror is amplified, because accepting oneself would also mean accepting anger. And anger, for them, has always been dangerous. So they repress it. They intellectualize it. They spiritualize it. They call it humility, forgiveness, or maturity. But unexpressed anger does not disappear. It turns inward. It becomes self-sabotage, chronic guilt, emotional numbness, or quiet self-hatred. This video is not about victims in the sentimental sense. It is about a psychological pattern, a structure, a survival strategy that slowly transforms into a prison. And the most tragic part is this. Many crushed individuals believe their suffering makes them morally superior, that their silence is strength, that their endurance is depth. But endurance without boundaries is not strength. It is erosion. In the next part, we will dissect how this psychology forms, why society silently rewards it, and how people who are constantly crushed often end up protecting the very systems that harm them. Not to judge them, but to understand the invisible chains they carry, and how those chains are rarely placed by others alone. Society does not accidentally produce crushed individuals. It cultivates them. Because a person who has learned to endure injustice quietly is far more useful than one who questions it loudly. From a psychological perspective, this is not conspiracy. It is structure. Institutions, schools, workplaces, families, even moral systems, function more smoothly when people internalize limits instead of challenging them. The crushed individual is predictable. They apologize quickly. They adapt silently. They overwork. They self-correct before anyone has to confront them. In behavioral psychology, compliance reinforced by intermittent punishment creates the most stable form of obedience. Not fear-based rebellion, but quiet submission disguised as cooperation. This is why the rebellious child is labeled difficult, while the silent one is called mature. The crushed person learns early that visibility is dangerous, that speaking up leads to humiliation, that resistance invites retaliation. So they develop a refined sensitivity to authority. They read moods. They anticipate expectations. They regulate themselves before being regulated. Michel Foucault described this as the internalization of power, when surveillance no longer needs an external watcher, because the individual has become their own guard. And here is the uncomfortable truth. Society rewards this. Not overtly, not with applause, but with conditional acceptance. You are good because you don't cause trouble. You are strong because you endure. You are wise because you stay quiet. But these are not compliments. They are behavioral incentives. Over time, the crushed individual begins to associate virtue with self-erasure. Boundaries feel immoral. Anger feels shameful. Self-assertion feels dangerous. They do not ask for more. They ask how to want less. And this is why society prefers them, because they stabilize dysfunctional systems without ever threatening to change them. They become emotional shock absorbers. They take the impact so others do not have to. In workplaces, they carry the workload no one else wants. In families, they become the peacemaker who absorbs conflict. In relationships, they tolerate imbalance and call it love. And when they finally break, they are not seen as casualties of a cruel structure, but as individuals who couldn't handle it. The system remains innocent. The crushed person carries the blame. Fromm warned that modern societies often confuse adaptation with health. But adapting to a sick system does not make you healthy. It makes you functional. The tragedy is that many crushed individuals defend the very structures that harm them, because admitting the system is unjust would mean admitting their suffering was unnecessary, and that realization is almost unbearable. So instead, they moralize endurance. They romanticize struggle. They tell themselves meaning is found in pain. But pain is not meaning. It is information. And ignored information does not disappear. It mutates. In the next section, we will go deeper into how this psychology becomes an identity, how suffering turns into moral currency, and why letting go of victimhood can feel more terrifying than staying crushed. That is where the real resistance begins. There is a moment when suffering stops being an experience and becomes a self-definition. At first, pain is something that happens to the individual. Later, it becomes something that happens through them, and eventually, something that defines who they are. This is the moral trap, because once suffering becomes identity, letting go of it feels like betrayal. The crushed individual does not merely endure pain, they build a worldview around it. I am the one who endures. I am the one who understands. I am the one who does not harm. On the surface, this looks like virtue, but psychologically, it is compensation. Alfred Adler argued that prolonged feelings of inferiority often give rise to moral superiority. Not because the individual is evil, but because dignity has underscored toggle to be restored somehow. When power is inaccessible, morality becomes power. The crushed individual learns that they may not win, but they can be right. They may not dominate, but they can be pure. And so, suffering is reframed as proof of depth, wisdom, and ethical elevation. This is why many crushed people distrust joy. Happiness feels naive. Confidence feels arrogant. Self-assertion feels corrupt. Pain becomes a credential. If I have suffered more, I understand more. If I endure longer, I am better. If I forgive endlessly, I am superior. But this moral elevation comes at a cost, because once suffering becomes identity, any attempt to escape it threatens the self. Healing feels like losing depth. Anger feels like becoming cruel. Boundaries feel like becoming selfish. So the crushed individual unconsciously sabotages relief. They stay in draining relationships. They remain in unjust environments. They reject opportunities that require self-assertion. Not because they want to suffer, but because suffering has become familiar, and familiarity feels like safety. Viktor Frankl famously wrote that meaning can be found in suffering, but he never claimed suffering itself was meaningful. Meaning arises from how one responds, not from how long one endures. And here lies the final cruelty of the moral trap. The individual begins to protect their suffering as if it were a fragile source of identity. Without it, who would they be? A person without pain must redefine themselves through desire, power, and choice. And those have always been forbidden territories. So the mind chooses the safer illusion. I suffer, therefore I am. But suffering is not essence. It is a condition. And confusing the two is how endurance turns into psychological captivity. The crushed individual does not only fear being harmed again, they fear becoming powerful. Because power, in their psychological history, has always worn the face of cruelty. When someone grows up around domination, humiliation, or emotional violence, the mind forms a dangerous equation. Power equals abuse. So the individual does something that looks moral, but is actually defensive. They reject strength itself. They distrust confidence. They mock ambition. They frame assertiveness as narcissism. They reinterpret weakness as virtue. This is not ethical clarity. It is psychological scar tissue. Carl Jung warned that what we reject in others is often what we have been forbidden to develop in ourselves. The crushed individual learns early that strength invites punishment, so they split their psyche. Aggression is pushed into the shadow. Desire is muted. Authority is externalized. What remains is a personality structured around restraint. But suppressed power does not disappear. It looks for indirect exits. Passive aggression, moral judgment, subtle sabotage, quiet contempt for those who dare to take up space. This is why some of the harshest critics of strength are those who have never been allowed to express it. They do not hate power. They hate what power did to them. And yet this hatred creates another trap. By rejecting strength, the crushed individual ensures they will always be subject to it. They remain morally clean, but strategically defenseless. They speak of peace, but never learn how to set boundaries. They value empathy, but cannot say no without guilt. And here is the paradox. The world does not stop exerting power just because someone refuses to engage with it. Power does not disappear when ignored. It concentrates elsewhere. Nietzsche argued that when direct will to power is denied, it returns as ressentiment, a moralized hostility toward life itself. This is how the crushed individual becomes bitter without ever appearing angry. They call domination evil, but never learn agency. They condemn authority, but never develop inner authority. And so they remain trapped between fear of being hurt and fear of becoming dangerous. The path forward is not becoming cruel. It is reclaiming strength without imitation, learning to hold power without abusing it, learning to express anger without becoming it, learning to take space without erasing others. In the final section, we will expose how crushed individuals unconsciously recreate oppressive dynamics, not because they want to dominate, but because unresolved power always repeats itself. That is where the cycle either breaks or begins again. The most disturbing truth is not that the crushed are harmed. It is that unresolved harm seeks repetition. Not out of malice, not out of desire for revenge, but because the psyche is drawn to what it knows. Sigmund Freud called this the repetition compulsion, the unconscious tendency to recreate familiar pain in the hope of finally gaining control over it. The crushed individual does not become a tyrant overnight. They become something subtler. They enforce rules rigidly. They moralize behavior obsessively. They punish indirectly. Where they once endured domination, they now administer it in diluted forms. They may not shout, but they withdraw affection. They may not threaten, but they guilt. They may not command, but they shame. This is how power re-enters the psyche through the back door. Because anger that was never allowed to exist does not vanish. It learns new disguises. Often, the crushed individual aligns themselves with authority figures, systems, or ideologies that mirror their original oppressors. Not because they believe in them fully, but because identification feels safer than resistance. If I stand with power, it cannot turn against me. This is how victims become guardians of the structure, how silence becomes enforcement, how suffering is recycled instead of resolved. Hannah Arendt observed that great harm is rarely committed by monsters. It is committed by ordinary people who stop questioning the role they play. The crushed individual may pride themselves on being ethical, fair, and harmless. Yet they unconsciously reproduce the same emotional climates that once suffocated them. Control replaces dialogue. Moral superiority replaces understanding. Endurance replaces change. And the cycle continues. Breaking this pattern does not begin with forgiveness. It begins with recognition. Recognizing that pain does not grant moral authority. Recognizing that goodness without boundaries is self-betrayal. Recognizing that refusing power does not make one innocent. It makes one predictable. True liberation requires something far less comfortable than kindness. It requires confrontation. Confronting anger without romanticizing it. Confronting desire without shaming it. Confronting power without worshiping or demonizing it. The crushed individual must learn to integrate what was forbidden. Strength without cruelty. Anger without violence. Authority without domination. Jung believed that psychological wholeness is not achieved by eliminating the shadow, but by making it conscious. This is the final choice. Remain morally intact but psychologically trapped, or risk becoming whole. Because what is not owned will always be repeated. And the most dangerous prison is the one that calls itself virtue.